Welcome, everyone, to the midday book program on two memoirs by journalists who have spent many years in Russia, Jill Dougherty and Marvin Kalb. I'm Patricia Cranes, Executive Director of the OPC. One of our OPC governors, Beth Knobel, will moderate. Beth and I met in the 1990s in Moscow when I worked for Business Week and she was reporting for the Los Angeles Times. I was there 7 years, but Beth stayed for double that time, 14 years. Most of that time, she was Moscow bureau chief for CBS News, where she received Emmy, Murrow, and Sigma Delta Chi awards for her work. Beth still freelances for CBS News, and you said you did this morning too, Beth, right? And assists with its Russia coverage. Her day job is associate producer at Fordham University in New York, teaching multi-platform journalism. Beth also serves as a trustee of the Columbia Daily Spectator and faculty advisor to Fordham student newspaper, The Ram. Beth will introduce our panelists, who will talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will take questions. Please put your questions in the chat. So Beth, now I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, spasiba, Patricia, and welcome to everybody in Zoom land and who will be watching this online. I'm absolutely thrilled to have two dear friends with us today to talk about their new memoirs about Russia. First, we'll hear from Jill Dougherty, who is probably familiar to most of you watching. She spent time as CNN's Moscow bureau chief, about a decade. She still works for CNN as an on-air contributor, commenting on Russian-related news. She had a long career at CNN outside of Moscow, including as a foreign affairs correspondent at the State Department, the U.S. Affairs editor, and the managing editor for CNN for its Asia Pacific coverage based in Hong Kong. She also is a scholar about Russia, not only having written this book, but written much research about Russia and the media, including as a fellow at the Joan Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, where I studied and which Marvin ran for many years. And Jill's also been associated with the Woodrow Wilson Center and the International Center for Defense and Security in beautiful Tallinn, Estonia. Our other panelist is someone I can say my life has not been, would have been the same without him. Marvin Kalb was my dissertation advisor at Harvard, where he spent about 25 years running and founding the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's also the Edward R. Murrow Professor Emeritus at Harvard. He had a 3-decade-long career as an award-winning reporter and commentator for CBS and NBC News, including Moscow bureau chief for CBS, the diplomatic correspondent for both CBS News and NBC News, and a turn as host of Meet the Press. He has written, Marvin, you're going to have to give me the right number because I keep seeing numbers everywhere. 18th book. He'll be talking about today, A Different Russia. It's part of his 3-volume memoir about life in Russia, where he worked from on and off from 1957 to 1962. And lastly, Marvin was recently inducted into the Emmy Golden Circle for 50 years of dedicated service to the profession of journalism. So welcome to you both. So delighted to have you here today. Jill, why don't you lead us off? Tell us about your memoir. Here it is. By the way, here it is. If you haven't ordered it, you all should. My Russia.
Thank you so much, Beth. Thanks, Patricia, and thanks, Beth, because you and I go back quite a long time to Moscow. And Marvin, really, it is a complete pleasure to see you virtually. I want a signature on this particular book, so you have to figure out how to do that. So, but I'm really glad, to talk about my book. So Marvin has done, 18, you said? This is my first, and I worked as a journalist for, I cannot tell you how many years, but roughly 40 years. And I've been very, very deeply interested in Russia for 50 years. So I finally got my act together and wrote this book beginning probably, I guess, about 4 or 5 years ago. So I thought, since there are journalists in the audience, I would kind of say how the book came about and then what I was trying to do in it. So it is not an academic book. I really wanted this for people who might be interested in Russia, interested in Putin. I actually thought about doing a Putin book, but a friend of mine said, Jill, you have a unique background. And I don't think I really valued it as much until he started saying, what it was. So I'm an average American. I was born in New York, lived here in DC, but pretty much my high school years I spent in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And Scranton at that point had 4 years of Russian, which was kind of unique at the time. We're going back to the Cold War. This is now 1963 to 1969. So that period in high school. And so it's really a Cold War memoir with reporting. So I would say, well, I'll tell you the structure, because the structure was kind of hard for me to figure out. I figured that there was a story to tell, but I wasn't quite sure how to structure it. I should have talked to Marvin before I even began. But ended up beginning almost cinematically in Moscow in February 2022, which I'm sure that strikes a chord with a number of people. That was the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin's full-scale invasion. As Beth mentioned, I worked for CNN for 3 decades. And after I left on a full-time basis, they would send me back for breaking news. And this time they called, this is now probably maybe late January, early February, they called and they said, we are convinced the US government is correct that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. So can you get to Moscow? And of course I said yes. And I think that was a very interesting moment journalistically, because that was what they refer to now as pre-buttal, like rebuttal, but pre-buttal, you probably know that term, where the US government revealed intelligence that it normally wouldn't publicly reveal. But it knew that the Russians were planning something, an invasion. And even at that point, you had the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, going to Moscow and saying to the Russians in very serious meetings, we know what you're up to, don't do it. And as John Sullivan, our ambassador, second last ambassador to Russia, said, and he talked to me, we did an interview, and he said, the Russians lied to our face. They kept saying, never, invasion, never. We will never invade. We don't invade, people invade us, the usual line. But of course they did. So I was in Moscow beginning in February and doing live shots. So that's where I begin the book. And it really was very, very interesting, because there was a weird virtual quality to it. It's kind of like kabuki theater. They had prepared this invasion, but of course they didn't want to say that they were invading, and yet they were justifying it. So it was, Putin on TV almost all the time, Putin on TV saying something, and it got actually even confusing for me. Did he say that? Is that live? Is that recorded? What are those people doing at the Kremlin? It was a very odd situation. So begin there, and then I go back to my story. So, personal story, Cold War, and the big events in my life. Sputnik, 1957, although I was a kid at the time, that really had an effect, because that kicked off the space race. And so John F. Kennedy, the space race with the Soviet Union, Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm thinking of my childhood. It was, yes, I played sports, and yes, I swam, but a lot of the events in my life at that tender age were Cuban Missile Crisis, Sputnik, etc. It was kind of odd, but I think this was one reason I got interested in Russian, because of the Cold War. And my father was a career special agent for the FBI. So there was this kind of like Nancy Drew quality that I had, where I thought I should know the language of the enemy. And so my sister, I have a twin sister, my sister and I studied Russian for 4 years in high school, then went on to study at the University of Michigan. And then we did, now this is where another kind of important thing in my life, which was the United States creating the possibility, creating fellowships and funding for studying critical languages. And Russian was a critical language at that point. So my teacher in high school, even though he was a native speaker, he had grown up in Scranton, PA, the son of Russian immigrants, but he had never taught Russian, or he had just started. So he got an NDEA fellowship, which was National Defense Education Act, 1958, to study in Russia. And then Pam and I later got NDFL, National Defense Foreign Language Fellowships, to study in Leningrad. So the government, you know, a lot of this was, I thank very much the US government for making it possible for me to do the things that I did and to get the preparation that I had. I also worked with the US Information Agency on those exhibits that went throughout the Soviet Union. Fascinating experience. You'd go for 6 months and just talk with Russians about the exhibit and whatever subject it was. I was on 2, and the most interesting was Research and Development USA, about the space program. Then we were exchange students, and we were in Leningrad State University. Oddly enough, at the time that Vladimir Putin was, we never met him. None of the Americans met him, but that's when he was a budding KGB officer getting training in the law. And then finally, so then it begins, you know, the journalism, and that's where, you know, I was at the White House, and then I ended up in Moscow. And there's a lot, I would say, there's some Gorby, because I did cover him, although he was before my time slightly, but I met him and things were happening in the 80s, so I would go back. But full-time, Yeltsin and Putin. And I continue to follow Putin to this day. I did work for the Voice of America, broadcasting in Russian, the VOA, which of course now is being destroyed, I believe. Not quite sure what the status of survival of VOA is at the present time, but you can follow that. Obviously, it's a footnote that we can all follow in the newspapers. And then finally, how did I physically put it together? I actually had an interesting thing, and I'll just wrap it up pretty quickly here. A friend of mine who's Irish, I wrote to him many letters from Russia when Pam and I were exchange students, and then also on these exhibits. And he kept those letters, complete with the stamps, for 50 years and gave them to me in like 2020 maybe, somewhere around there. Gave them to me, and it was a gold mine of very long descriptions about what we had gone through. And then I had some diaries, and then I had scripts for almost 10 years, as Beth pointed out. So all of those were sources. So I get into, in the book, a lot on Ukraine, a lot on the media, the Baltics, Georgia to a certain extent, post-Soviet nostalgia, one of my favorite subjects. I actually have a little section on vodka, which I thought I should put in there. And I think. And the last thing I'll say, and here I really will wrap up, I begin it myself, let's say, you know, when I went to, well, in high school, but really when I went to Russia as an exchange student, I was 20. And I teach at Georgetown, and my students are roughly 20. So there's kind of like a bookend to this, where I talk about being in Moscow during the invasion and having to teach, and my students being able to talk live to young Russians who were facing that, you know, bitter, shocking truth that their country was invading another country. And then I end the book with exactly that, which to me is very, very important. Where do young people go? Where do young people, not only in Ukraine who are dying in the war, but young Russians some of whom are dying in the war, but are definitely having their country transform in front of their eyes. So I leave it with a question, and I can say actually blame it on Putin, because he's the one who started this war. And the results of that war, I think, will be pretty devastating for quite a long time. So that's it, and I'll turn it over to Marvin.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Jill. By the way, we'll be putting, if we haven't already, we'll be putting links to the books in the chat. And please be thinking of questions, and I'll call for those in a little bit. Okay, Marvin, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Beth, and great to be on a program with you, Jill. And your book sounds terrific, just terrific. A wonderful immersion in Russia. This book, A Different Russia, is my 18th, and I was joking before when I said, what does an old man do? What does an old retired journalist do? You think back to the most exciting times that you had as a journalist, and I was blessed to have had extraordinary opportunities to cover some of the large moments between the US and the USSR during the Cold War. And Jill, you talked about getting involved in the Cold War, and that was an extraordinary time. I think that people today do not quite grasp that a lot of people during the Cold War in the 1950s, 1960s, these dark days of the Cold War, you did not know at that time whether the crisis on Berlin would lead to a nuclear war, crisis on Cuba would lead to a nuclear war. And for a journalist, I can tell you flat out, it was an incredibly exciting story. And I put it into 3 memoirs. The third is the one I'm talking about today, A Different Russia. It takes place in the period from January 1961 until the fall in 1963. It was a fantastic moment because it started with Kennedy coming into office. Kennedy puts out the word, yeah, under certain circumstances, I'd like to meet Khrushchev. I'd like to talk to him, see whether we can do something together. Khrushchev, unashamedly, was putting out the word through journalists, through the embassy people. I'm very interested in meeting and having a summit meeting with this new president. Khrushchev had met Kennedy in August 1959 when Khrushchev visited the United States. He was up on Capitol Hill. He shook hands with Kennedy. He always had in his mind, very handsome young man, but very young. What's he doing with that kind of senatorial responsibility? Well, he is now president of the United States, still very young. And they want to meet, but there are obstacles. First, there is the murder of Patrice Lumumba, who was Khrushchev's man in the Congo. And Khrushchev felt that that was a nasty thing that the colonialists did. I've always keep that in my mind. What he downplayed was the American role in the murder of Patrice Lumumba. And a couple of months after that, there was the deep disappointment for the United States of what happened in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. And in Khrushchev's mind at that time, he couldn't figure out, and we were told this quite frankly by a number of his people, he couldn't figure out how an American president would allow himself to get so trapped that he would be embarrassed that his people were wiped out by Castro, who was waiting for them. Big humiliation. Khrushchev kind of put that in his hip pocket. And they did work out the summit meeting, the only time they actually met, in Vienna, June 2nd and 3rd, or 3rd and 4th, of 1961. I've covered quite a few of the summits, and this one was a highlight because there was so much advanced expectation that great things were going to happen. Well, what happened, in fact, was that after 2 days of talking, Khrushchev left believing that Kennedy could be taken to the cleaners. I say that because on that Sunday night, I bumped into someone a Russian I knew from Moscow, who was an interpreter and worked with Khrushchev. And I said, give me a couple of sentences on what was Khrushchev's vision of Kennedy. And he said, I'll tell you in 3 words. Very young. I said, well, that's obvious. What else? Highly inexperienced. He doesn't quite know what he's saying. And weak. He's reflecting weakness. And this was something that really stuck in my mind because Khrushchev was a very emotional Russian leader. I had quite a few occasions actually to talk to him. And those conversations went from American basketball, believe it or not, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Khrushchev had an instinct about people. In this sense, perhaps he's a little bit like Trump. I don't know that he read a great deal, but he depended on his instincts. And he felt that with Kennedy, maybe he could work out a deal, but more than likely, he's going to try to take advantage of that. And in the spring of 1962, when he was at a meeting in Bulgaria and took a walk with his defense minister along the beach, and Malinowski pointed to the water and he said, across the Black Sea, he said, the Americans have missiles. We knew about that, but we know now that they're operational. They're pointed at the Soviet Union. Khrushchev got one of his emotional moments, began to scream, and then he yelled out, we're going to put a hedgehog in Uncle Sam's pants, and he's going to feel very unhappy. And that was the moment that the Cuban Missile Crisis hatched. He was going to do something, not quite knowing what. Within the next month, he had a series of, quote, big secret meetings with his people. Cuba was going to be where it was going to happen. And remarkably, over the next 6 months, 5 months, he moved 50,000 Soviet troops, missiles, we know post facto, some of them equipped with nuclear warheads, through the Dardanelles, across the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic Ocean. The United States knew nothing. When the Russians want to keep a secret, they really can keep a secret. And it was only to the end of August that through American senators talking about word that they got from Cuban exiles, that word began to peek out in Washington, not Moscow, in Washington, that something big was going on. But in this book, what I try very hard to do was to explain, to give you a picture of what it was like in Moscow at that time, in the build-up to the Cuban crisis. I thought reading the press, talking to as many Russians, etc., I would always go out to the Russian marketplace on the outskirts of Moscow, not to buy food necessarily, but just to talk to Russians and find out a little bit what was on their minds. Because sometimes you can get trapped reading Pravda into thinking that that's necessarily what the Russian people are thinking, sometimes not at all. And the Russians kept on saying to me, ordinary folks, Berlin, that is where we might have won. Berlin, don't push us too hard on Berlin, which was then a divided city, a residue of what had been left over from World War II. On, I believe, October 22nd, we get word through the American Embassy in Moscow. The president is going to be making a big speech. We're going to set it up so that you guys can hear it. And through CBS, we worked out a deal where I could hear the president's speech and then comment from Moscow what I thought about it. And that was a stunner, because what the president said in effect was, Russia, stop a quarantine of Cuba. If you don't get your stuff out, we are going to consider an attack upon us as justification for an attack on you. And suddenly in Moscow, what had been sensed suddenly materialized. We realized we were in the middle of something very serious. And each day became an additional impetus of crisis. It kept flowering. On Tuesday, the following day, Khrushchev appears at the Bolshoi Theater because an American opera star is performing Boris Godunov. Now think about this. The president's just announced, in effect, whoops, watch it, kids, danger, real danger. Khrushchev goes to an American opera star's performance. I was saying to myself, this guy is seeking a way out. But how do you get out? Since he's the one who put the missiles in. On Wednesday, Khrushchev meets with an American businessman and spends 2 hours with him, as if he's got nothing else in the world to do. What to think about it? 2 hours with him, making what point? Let us talk. We can always get out of a problem. Talk. Thursday, the UN Deputy Secretary General comes in with an absurd proposal. Let's take 3 weeks and we'll have a summit meeting that will last 3 weeks and we'll get rid of the crisis in that way. It was absurd. Kennedy said, get your missiles out. Got nowhere. Friday, the president receives a letter from Khrushchev that was Khrushchev at his most emotional. In effect, warning, don't mess with us because we are very powerful. We can do all kinds of things to you. And you are the people who are going to have to back off on Berlin. I can tell you that the people at the embassy in Moscow, the West German embassy, very clued in. Everyone was absolutely terrified that maybe this was going to get out of hand. On Saturday, another letter from Khrushchev, totally different. Totally different. Let's find a way out of this. Sunday, the big day, October 29th, I start by going off to the marketplace outside of Moscow. And again, the theme that I heard was very specific. Cuba, forget about it. It's not important. Who cares about it? Berlin, watch Berlin. There, we're going to fight you, but we have no interest in fighting you on. This is ordinary stuff from ordinary people. And what you're talking about is a nuclear war possibility. I go back to the office, get my stuff, go down to Central Telegraph. And my first broadcast, given the time difference, was at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, Moscow time. I bump into a Russian Moscow radio guy whom I knew for many years. And I thought I'd get a nice friendly response from him. And I say, what's up? And he doesn't want to answer me. I don't take offense, I sort of back off. He then talks to the woman behind the desk. And I overheard him say, Yuri, that's the Russian name, and I'm beginning to think, maybe he's thinking about the Yuri who does all of the famous broadcasts, who does something only of major significance on Moscow radio. And I set up, and he tells me, listen to the 5 o'clock broadcast on Moscow radio. I listened to it at 5 o'clock. We set up 2 lines to New York. Excuse my throat. 2 lines to New York. One is a line for me if I had anything to say. The other, they're listening to Moscow radio. And I'm listening to this man whose last name at the moment, forgive me, this is really old age.
It's Levitan.
Levitan. He is speaking. I know the voice, I know the guy. And I'm saying to myself, this is either a proclamation of war or the other side, some form of peace. And in the 3rd sentence, he says, 2 words jump out at him. One is crate, like crate in, put stuff in a crate, bundle it up. And the other was remove. And I screamed out on my line, he has just caved. And Blair Clark, my boss at the other end, says, can we go with that? I said, let me listen another sentence or 2. Then it was clear that Khrushchev had said he's going to pull out of Cuba. What a story, and what a moment in history. And that you lived through it, believe me, it's an incredibly exciting thing to be able to go back and resurrect moments like that. The very end of the book, I mentioned that they did reach an agreement, the first atmospheric nuclear test ban agreement. If it was all left to Khrushchev, I think we might have seen better times. But Khrushchev did something that they called a harebrained scheme, and it surely was, and he almost got the world into a nuclear war, but he had the guts to acknowledge the mistake, and he pulled out. And in conclusion, I would just say, wrapping it up with a contemporary moment, I truly believe that if Putin had been the Soviet leader at that time, in October 1962, he would not have had the guts to acknowledge a huge personal and political blunder, which is what Khrushchev did, and we'd have had a war. Whether it would have led to a nuclear exchange, who knows, but a war which we could all have done without and ultimately did. And that was sort of the wrap up of the book. But I'd love to hear, questions and comments, whatever. Great fun. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marvin. I just want to encourage everybody to put their questions in the chat, and I will start reading those in just a second, but I'm going to throw a question out. I enjoyed these books so much. I learned so much about both of you and about the challenges of covering Russia, whether it was figuring out how to get film out or how to read the tea leaves, which you both did so astutely. One thing about you, Jill, that I did not know was that you had been kissed by Vladimir Putin. Did you ever come to understand what he was after?
It's so weird because I almost entitled the book, Putin's Kiss or something like that, but it seemed ridiculous. But it actually did happen. Briefly, I was at Valdai, which is this, or continues, no Americans go anymore, but a yearly meeting in which Putin kind of expounds about his ideas for 4 hours, a big confab of people. And I wanted to make a pitch for CNN to do an interview with him, made my way to him, had a brief conversation because he did remember, he knew who I was. And as I turn to his press flack, he kisses me. And so in the book, I mean, as Beth knows, I thought, whoa, Putin has kissed me. And I think that was one of the purposes for what he did. But I use that as an example of how Putin acts, because I very quickly talked to a Russian friend, a female, and she's a journalist, and she said, oh, Putin kissed me too. So we both sat down and decided, why would he do that? Because the bottom line for me was Putin almost never does anything in public that he hasn't kind of prepared. He's kind of an actor in many ways, and as Marvin said about Khrushchev, I think Putin has kind of the KGB version of that, which is taking stock of the person he's talking to, figuring out how do you manipulate that person, how do you make them like you, because what you're trying to do is recruit them to do what you want. And so I think in that case, probably there are a million reasons. He's happy to see me, the old days when you could actually get positive stories about Russia. The other, I think, was to kind of discombobulate me, which he successfully did. The other one was misogyny. He's definitely a misogynist with a capital M. And then just kind of, upending the table to make an exit. So there are many different reasons, but I've seen that behavior with Putin. I think he's very interesting person to watch because he is not flamboyant. He is like the opposite of Khrushchev, but it doesn't mean that he's not trying to do things, subterranean things in his conversations and public appearances.
Yeah, thank you, Sue, for that. I mean, that they're both these books are so much a portrait of a president as well as a portrait of a journalist. Let me go to some of the questions, and then I'll ask some more if we get done. The first one comes from Jeff Trimble. Здравствуйте, Jeff. Great to have you here. The former U.S. News and World Report correspondent in Moscow, former head of RFERL. Jeff says this, terrific discussion. Yevgeny Zamatin, author of the 1920s dystopian novel We, quickly soured on the Bolshevik Revolution and concluded that, quote, Russia has only one future, its past. Looking at today's Russia, one might be inclined to accept Zamyatin's gloomy assessment. Do you agree? Could history from the Cold War through the collapse of the Soviet Union and beyond have produced a different Russia? And are there realistic grounds to foresee a better future for the country? Thank you, Jeff. Tough question. Would like to start?
Yeah, I'll jump in really briefly. Yes, I tend to kind of agree with that. And especially if you look at Putin, that's exactly what he's doing. He's going back to the past. He's rewriting history. He's talking about history 1,000 years ago. He really is very past oriented, I think. The only thing that, and I tell my students this, is that in the midst of, this kind of retrograde approach, unexpected things can happen. Like Marvin, I'm a fan of Khrushchev. I agree that he actually, on some level, was braver and more unique and interesting than Putin in terms of what he did. And I'm also a fan of Gorbachev, who is these days in Russia? Nobody. But, we did not expect that there would be a Gorbachev. And he came out, he was there, obviously. He began to change the country. But the way he changed with glasnost and perestroika, especially glasnost, I think giving people the opportunity to read the books they couldn't read and to say the things they could never say was monumental. The problem was that the institutions, those kind of green shoots of Russian-style democracy, were not strengthened. They began, in my view, but but the institutions of democracy were very quickly, in the kind of the chaos of Yeltsin, they came up, they grew, to continue this analogy, kind of like a garden with a whole lot of weeds and nobody could tell what was growing. And then Putin comes in and says, we're going to clean this up. And so Putin comes in, establishes the power vertical, and all of those little green shoots are gone. And I think that's the tragedy of Russia, that the institutions of democracy were not installed in a very secure way. And they're paying the price right now.
Jeff, if you were not a student of history yourself, you wouldn't have asked that question. Russians are thoroughly absorbed with their own history, and they always have been. They write, if you go back 400, 500, 600 years, you'll find priests who write a kind of memoir. What are they writing about? Not themselves. They're writing about the glory of Mother Russia and various aspects of how Russia fits in to the West. What is it that's happening in our great, marvelous country? That is something that absorbed people to this day. There are articles written by Russians who've recently left Russia and Russians in Russia about who are they and where do they fit into the West and the East. That kind of searching for oneself has been going on forever and a day. And I think the split between the people who look toward the West for inspiration is deep within that country. And even though Putin may be trying to push towards the Eastern analysis, the more Mongol-rooted political system in Russia, I don't know which way this is going to end up, who does. But the fight will go on, no matter who ends up winning. I think that Putin is a short timer. I know that nobody will buy that, but I think we're at a point in Russian history where the Russian people are ready for another spontaneous stickiness, something that just will erupt. It doesn't sound right because the system today is so locked in with police. It is so much a dictatorship today, but it's thoroughly corrupt up and down the line. And there are so many people in Russia who still remember their connections with the West. You know, the funny thing about Khrushchev always was he kept reaching out to the West because he wanted to deal with the West. He sort of thought of himself in the tradition of Peter the Great, that Peter went and lived in the West for a year, because there is that pull and there is that insecurity within Russian history. And they're looking for a route. They haven't found it. Maybe they'll never find it. But the battle goes on, and we'll all be surprised when it happens.
Thanks to you both. Next question from Al Pessin, the former VOA correspondent, says hello to you both. Are you more or less worried about the potential for a US-Russia war than you were in the 1960s and 1970s?
Very quickly, I am. I am very concerned now because I don't trust the solidity of that Kremlin leadership, and I don't know who does exactly what is lurking around the corner of Putin, and who knows the people who will follow. But insecurity is not a good thing. Uncertainty is not a good thing. And if you are balancing that uncertainty in the Kremlin, if I'm right, against the obvious uncertainty of the White House, you have the ingredients for an explosion.
Jill?
I would say briefly, I agree. And I would say, if you compare it to the old Soviet days, there were more people making decisions in the power structure than there are right now. It's essentially Putin and his minions, close associates, many of whom come from the power ministries, security services and intelligence. Putin is talking about nuclear weapons all the time. Now, I still, I hope, believe that he does not want an all-out nuclear war. I do not think he's crazy, but he is flirting with this. And when you get into this flirting and threatening, things can happen. We almost had nuclear war. We almost had, except for a Russian, a Soviet, and I forget the year, but it was in the late 80s, who actually was in the nuclear forces, who decided that one of the alerts that they had was false, and actually kind of called off a response. We owe to that man our lives. I mean, it could have been a war. So I'm really more concerned about the potential for unexpected, by mistake, somebody does something, quick reaction. Everything is so very quick right now. And response times are very, very fast. That's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, thank you. While we're on the subject of military conflict, Meg, I'll come to your question in a minute, but I'd like to ask one from the great CBS radio correspondent, Peter Mayer. Great to have you here, Peter. What are your assessments of the Trump-Putin relationship, especially at this moment in the Ukraine conflict? What do you make of all the often outlandish Trump mixed messages, both to and about Putin and Zelensky?
My sense is that Trump wants very much to get a Nobel Prize. He wants to, people talk about him maybe running for the Pope. We have reached a point of, in my judgment, could be different, of utter insanity. There is something, again, in my judgment, profoundly wrong with our president, and he says strange things. And again, that leads to uncertainty. And that is terribly dangerous, particularly when he's working opposite a skillful former KGB person who is determined in his mind to recapture the glory of Mother Russia. And that can only be done if you have Ukraine. You can't recapture the glory of Mother Russia, of the Slavic world, with just Belarus and Belarus and Russia. It just doesn't work. And I think, Peter, that the crisis that we have today is leadership instability, despite the way it looks, on both sides, which is a formula for danger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Once again, I agree with Marvin. And I think what we've got is, with the American president, a guy who thinks that you can, have a deal, strike a deal with the other person because you manipulate him, which I think President Trump has been trying to do. Be nice to Putin, be mean to Zelensky. Kind of be nice to Zelensky, be a little mean to Putin. But a lot of it is rhetorical when it comes to Russia, and it's reality when it comes to Ukraine. I think Putin looks at Trump, and this goes back, Putin has read the case file from the 80s when Trump was there trying to build a hotel and, being a businessman, et cetera. I think they know who Trump is. And I share much of what Marvin is saying. I think, they've studied him. They always do, we do the same thing. Psychological studies of who this guy is. And he, as Putin looks at him, I think Putin looks at Trump as a person without a lot of historical knowledge about the world and what makes things important. Putin looks at history, and it is very important. He says, he reads books. He justified Ukraine with an historical treatise that was gigantic and went back, thousands of years. So they're fundamentally looking at the world in different ways. Trump is much more simplistic, and not to say that, Putin is an intellectual, but he's a smart man. He really is a smart person. And so with the KGB training, I think he is doing everything to manipulate Trump. And, sending the portrait back with Witkoff. Oh, how lovely, portrait of the president. He knew that would go over well. He says things, but he's always very careful. He lets other people, like the former President Medvedev, say all the nasty, weird, crazy stuff. It's all manipulation. And that said, the American president has a much bigger economy, has a much bigger army with NATO, and is much more powerful. So Putin will play it as long as he can. And, we'll have to see. I honestly don't know where we're going with Ukraine, but it is fascinating. I'll just add one other thing that I was thinking about. When you look at the game that they're playing, Peter, I think we have to remember that each person has a domestic audience that they also are playing to. So Trump, there's no question. We know about his domestic audience and MAGA, et cetera. Putin, the Kremlin does a lot of polling. The Kremlin actually is interested in what people are saying. So Putin can't look like a weakling who is influenced by the American president. So he's got a kind of a more complicated game. He has to look strong to his own people, but he can't overplay his hand, although he does and will overplay his hand with the American president. It's really interesting to watch.
Just one quick addition here. Who are the people around President Trump who know anything beyond what they read in the newspaper about Russia?
No one.
We are surrounded by people who may mean well, but know very little about Russia. We don't have reporters there for very good reason. Russia comes through one-dimensionally to people who do not understand that it is composed of many dimensions. And that is a scary thing for me. Mr. Witkoff might be the greatest real estate guy ever in New York, but that doesn't make him the negotiator for Russia and the Ukraine war, for Iran. I mean, come on. It's madness.
We've only got about 3 minutes left because Jill has a hard out. She's going to be appearing on Echo Moskvy. So I'm going to throw one question at each of you from the audience. So Marvin, your daughter is a professor of Russian language and literature. So this question is for you from Meg Napier. I hope I said that right. I'm under the impression that academic study of the Russian language, as well as Russian politics and culture, have diminished drastically since the fall of the Soviet Union, leaving us poorly equipped to understand and interact with its leaders. Do you agree?
Absolutely agree, 100%. The study of Russia, of the Soviet Union, of communism, all of that stuff has diminished so that it's barely traceable. Language programs all over the country are now being diminished, not increased, but diminished, shriveling up. We are almost deliberately hurting ourselves by denying us the information that is required by all of us to understand more about Russia today. It has always been a question mark. Churchill made that clear, but that doesn't mean it has to be a question. We can study.
Thanks, Marvin. Last question to you, Jill. This is from Elez Biberai. I hope I said that. The retired VOA Eurasia Division Director, as you are a VOA alum, Jill. Can you discuss the potential informational consequences for the United States in silencing the voice of America, particularly in the context of Russia's global media influence and its weaponization of information?
Oh, I think it's a disaster. both VOA and RFERL. They have millions of followers, people who watch online, read online, and they have a lot of influence in those countries where it's not like the Soviet Union. People can get a lot of information from a lot of different places, but Russia is increasingly shutting down news sources. I mean, they've just tried to slow down YouTube, and you cannot get Facebook or Instagram. I believe both of those are gone now. So they're constricting the information. And so obviously, I am really opposed to the cutbacks. I think they are short-sighted. And if you look at Russia and China, they will fill the gap. They are happy to go in and do as much broadcasting and online work as possible because they sense a big opportunity. I just think it's really short-sighted, but I do think it comes from a warped idea of what international broadcasting and communications for the US government is about. It's not about saying America is wonderful. It's about telling the truth about the United States and about the country to which they are broadcasting or communicating information. And that is what people desperately need. So this is a huge, in my estimation, a huge mistake.
I wish we had another hour, but we don't. Jill, Marvin, thank you so much for being with us. These here are the memoirs. They're absolutely wonderful. There's information in the chat about buying them. You should all buy them. They're fantastic. To our audience, thank you for finding the time. To the OPC, thank you for hosting today. And everyone, be well and das vidanya.